The golden elevator doors slid open with barely a whisper, revealing the most exclusive dining room in all of Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting rainbow patterns across white marble floors. This was the Meridian Club, where membership cost more than most people earned in 5 years. Tonight was special. The tech world's biggest names had gathered for their monthly dinner meeting. These weren't just wealthy people. They were the kind of wealthy that made headlines, the kind who could buy small countries if they felt like it. Their conversations weren't about paying bills or weekend plans. They talked about buying companies like others discussed picking up groceries. In the corner of the room sat something truly magnificent, a black piano that gleamed under the soft lighting. It was a Steinway, the kind of instrument that concert halls dreamed of owning. The piano had sat there for years, more decoration than instrument. Most guests barely noticed it anymore. It had become part of the scenery, like the expensive paintings on the walls or the fresh orchids on every table. But tonight, someone did notice it. Her name was Lily, and she was 24 years old. She wore the crisp black uniform of the club's waitstaff, a simple dress with a white apron, polished black shoes that clicked softly against the marble. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place. The club had strict rules about appearance. Everything had to be perfect. Lily moved through the room like a ghost, refilling water glasses before they emptied, replacing silverware before anyone asked. She had been working at the Meridian Club for 8 months now, and she knew the routine by heart. Be invisible. Be efficient. Don't speak unless spoken to. And definitely don't let the guests know anything about your real life. What the guests didn't know was that Lily spent her mornings at the most famous music school in the country. While they slept in their penthouse apartments, she was in practice rooms, her fingers dancing across piano keys for hours. She had been playing since she was 5 years old, ever since her grandmother first showed her how to find middle C. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, serving drinks to people who probably spent more on wine in one evening than she spent on rent in a month, while one of the world's finest pianos sat silent just a few feet away. She tried not to look at it too often. It made her chest tight with longing. Tonight's host was particularly loud. Richard Blackstone had made his fortune in technology, creating apps that billions of people used every day. His company's logo was as recognizable as any brand in the world. At 45, he owned 3 homes, a yacht, and more cars than he could count. He also owned something else, a reputation for being difficult. The other guests seemed to enjoy his company, laughing at his jokes and nodding along with his stories. But Lily had served enough of these dinners to recognize the difference between genuine laughter and the polite kind that came with business relationships. These people needed each other, but that didn't mean they always liked each other. The market is going to crash within 6 months, Blackstone was saying, cutting into his steak with aggressive precision. I'm telling you all now so you can't say I didn't warn you. The signs are everywhere if you know how to look. An older woman across the table raised her eyebrows. Victoria Chen had been investing for longer than Blackstone had been alive, and she didn't appreciate being lectured. You said the same thing 2 years ago, Richard. And 3 years before that. This time is different, he insisted, taking a large gulp of wine. His face was already flushed from alcohol, and they were only halfway through dinner. The fundamentals are all wrong. Lily refilled his glass without being asked, a skill she had perfected over months of reading people's drinking patterns. Blackstone barely glanced at her. To him, she wasn't really there at all. She was just part of the service, like the air conditioning or the soft music playing in the background. As she moved around the table, Lily caught fragments of other conversations. Someone was buying a sports team. Someone else was funding a private space mission. They discussed these ventures the way normal people talked about buying a new car or planning a vacation. The amounts of money were staggering, but they spoke about millions like pocket change. I'm thinking of buying that little island off the coast of Greece, one man mentioned casually, while buttering his bread. Perfect for the summer house. Which island? Victoria asked, as if islands were as common as vacation homes. The one with the Roman ruins. Comes with its own harbor. Lily tried to imagine having so much money that buying an island was a casual dinner conversation. Her own summer plans involved working extra shifts to help pay for her fall tuition. The contrast was almost surreal. She paused by the piano, unable to help herself. Her eyes traced the elegant curves of the instrument, The way the light reflected off its polished surface, she could almost feel the keys under her fingertips, could almost hear the music that was trapped inside waiting to be released. "Miss, we need more wine over here," someone called out. Lily snapped back to attention, her cheeks burning slightly. She had been caught staring, lost in her daydreams. She hurried over with the wine bottle, pouring carefully and professionally. The evening continued with course after course of perfectly prepared food. The guests barely seemed to notice what they were eating, too caught up in their discussions of deals and acquisitions. For them, this dinner was just another business meeting, another opportunity to network and share information. But for Lily, it was something else entirely. It was a glimpse into a world so different from her own that it might as well have been another planet. A world where money was no object, where dreams were limited only by imagination rather than bank accounts. As the main course plates were cleared away, the conversation grew louder and more animated. The wine was flowing freely now, and inhibitions were dropping along with the level in the bottles. Blackstone's voice rose above the others, his gestures becoming more dramatic as he told a story about outmaneuvering a business rival. Lily moved efficiently around the room, clearing plates and preparing for the dessert course. She had learned to work around conversations without interrupting them, to be present but invisible. It was an art form that took months to master. The piano continued to call to her, its silent presence a constant reminder of the music that filled her days. Soon she would finish her shift and head home to her tiny apartment. Tomorrow morning she would be back at school, back in her real world where music mattered more than money. But for now she was here, serving dessert to people who had everything except, perhaps, the simple joy of making music with their own hands. The dessert course had arrived, delicate chocolate soufflés that had taken the kitchen team 3 hours to prepare. Each one was a work of art, dusted with gold flakes that caught the light from the chandeliers above. Lily served each guest with practiced grace, her movements smooth and efficient despite the growing tension she felt in the room. The wine had clearly taken its effect on several guests, but none more so than Richard Blackstone. His earlier confidence had transformed into something more aggressive, more reckless. He leaned back in his chair, surveying the room like a king holding court. His eyes were slightly unfocused, but his voice carried clearly across the marble floors. "You know what I love about evenings like this?" he announced to no one in particular. "It's not just the food or the company. It's the honesty. We can all stop pretending here. We all know exactly what we are and what we're worth." The other guests exchanged glances. Victoria Chen, the experienced investor, set down her spoon with deliberate precision. She had seen this behavior before in younger entrepreneurs who hadn't learned to handle their success gracefully. "Richard, perhaps you should slow down a bit," she suggested gently, but Blackstone waved her off with a dismissive gesture. No, I'm just getting started. This is when things get interesting." He took another large gulp of wine, his movements becoming more exaggerated. "See, most people live their whole lives pretending they're something they're not. But in here, we don't have to pretend. We're the real deal." Lily continued her work, removing empty plates and refilling water glasses. She could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting, becoming uncomfortable. The easy conversation from earlier had been replaced by something more unpredictable. She had worked enough events to recognize when alcohol was turning sociable guests into difficult ones. As she reached for Blackstone's empty dessert plate, her eyes drifted momentarily to the piano. It was an unconscious glance, the kind that happens when you're trying to find a moment of peace in a tense situation. The beautiful instrument seemed to offer a silent refuge from the growing awkwardness at the dinner table. But Blackstone caught the glance. His alcohol-clouded mind seized on it like a predator spotting movement in tall grass. Well, he said, his voice cutting through the conversations around the table. "What do we have here?" The room fell quiet. All eyes turned first to Blackstone, then followed his gaze to Lily, who stood frozen with his empty plate still in her hands. She felt her heart begin to race, though she wasn't sure why. Something in his tone warned her that trouble was coming. "Our little waitress keeps looking at that piano," Blackstone continued, his words slightly slurred but perfectly audible. "I've been watching you, sweetheart. Every few minutes your eyes drift over there like you're hoping it might start playing itself." The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the kind of behavior they expected at the Meridian Club, even from someone as successful as Blackstone. The club had strict policies about treating staff with respect, policies that Blackstone seemed to be forgetting with each sip of wine. "Sir, I was just clearing the table," Lily said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She had been trained to handle difficult situations with professional calm, but something about Blackstone's attention felt different. Dangerous. "Oh, I bet you were," he said with a laugh that had no warmth in it. "But that's not all, is it? Come on, don't be shy. You keep staring at that piano like you want to touch it, like you think you could actually play it." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria Chen looked mortified. The other guests stared at their hands or their wine glasses, clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to intervene without making the situation worse. Blackstone pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. He stood up, swaying slightly, and pointed at the piano with theatrical flair. "I'll tell you what," he announced, his voice growing louder and more mocking with each word. "I'm feeling generous tonight. Really generous. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have ourselves some entertainment." He turned his attention fully to Lily now, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "You, sweetheart, are going to play that piano for us. Right now. And if you can actually play something decent, and I mean actually decent, not just some chopsticks nonsense, I'll tip you $1,000. The amount was shocking. More money than Lily made in a month at the club. But the way he said it made it clear that he didn't expect to pay it. This wasn't generosity, it was cruelty disguised as entertainment. "But," Blackstone continued, raising one finger like a teacher making a point, "when you embarrass yourself, and trust me, you will embarrass yourself, you're going to clear all our dishes for the rest of the night without saying a single word. Not one word. You'll be our silent little servant just like you should be." The other guests looked horrified. This had gone far beyond acceptable behavior, even by the standards of wealthy people who were used to getting their way. "Richard, this is completely inappropriate," Victoria said firmly. "The young woman is just doing her job." "Oh, come on, Victoria," Blackstone shot back, his words becoming more slurred. "Don't tell me you're not curious. Look at her, she obviously thinks she can play. Probably one of those delusional waitresses who thinks she's going to be discovered at some coffee shop. Well, here's her big chance." He gestured broadly at the piano, nearly losing his balance in the process. "There it is, sweetheart. Your moment in the spotlight. Your big audition. Show us what you've got, or admit that you're just another dreamer with no actual talent." Lily stood perfectly still, the empty plate trembling slightly in her hands. Every instinct told her to apologize, to make an excuse, to disappear into the kitchen and hope this moment would pass. The professional thing to do would be to deflect, to politely decline, to maintain the invisible barrier between staff and guests. But something else was happening inside her. 8 months of being invisible, of pretending she was nothing more than a uniform and a smile, of watching these people dismiss everyone around them as unworthy of their attention. It was all building up like pressure in a steam engine. The piano sat there in the corner, patient and waiting. She thought about her morning practice sessions, the hours she spent perfecting pieces that these people would probably recognize from movie soundtracks. She thought about the acceptance letter to the Vienna Conservatory that she kept hidden in her dresser drawer, the opportunity she couldn't afford to take because she was too busy serving dessert to people who treated her like furniture. "Well," Blackstone demanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "what's it going to be? Are you going to show us this amazing talent? Or are you going to admit that you're just another nobody with big dreams and no ability to back them up?" The other guests watched in horrified fascination. Some pulled out their phones, though. Whether to record the humiliation or to call for help, it wasn't clear. The entire situation had spiraled beyond anything they had expected when they arrived for a simple business dinner. Victoria Chen tried once more to intervene. "Richard, you're drunk and you're being incredibly rude. This young woman doesn't owe you any kind of performance." But Blackstone ignored her completely. His attention was focused entirely on Lily now, like a cat watching a cornered mouse. "I'm waiting," he said with exaggerated patience. "Either sit down at that piano and show us what you've got, or get back to work and stop pretending you're something special." The moment stretched out like a held breath. Everyone in the room seemed to be waiting for something to happen, though no one was sure what. The chandeliers cast their rainbow light across the scene. The expensive orchids perfumed the air, and in the corner, The beautiful piano sat silent and ready. Lily looked at the instrument, then back at Blackstone's mocking face, then at the other guests who were watching with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. Her whole body was shaking now, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Something that felt like lightning building up inside her chest. The plate in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed nothing at all. The uniform that had made her invisible for 8 months felt like a costume she was ready to shed. And the piano that had been calling to her all evening was about to get an answer. Time seemed to slow down as Lily stood there, holding the empty dessert plate in her trembling hands. The chandelier light felt too bright, the room too quiet despite being filled with people. Every eye was on her now, waiting to see what she would do. Some looked curious, others embarrassed, but all were watching. Blackstone leaned against his chair, arms crossed, wearing that cruel smile like a badge of honor. He was so certain of what would happen next. In his mind, she would mumble some excuse, maybe claim she couldn't play, and then slink back to the kitchen where she belonged. He would have his entertainment, his moment of power over someone who couldn't fight back. But as Lily looked at him, something unexpected happened. Instead of the fear or shame he expected to see, he caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes. Something that made him shift uncomfortably despite his alcohol-fueled confidence. "Well?" he pressed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. "We're all waiting." Lily set the plate down on the nearest table with deliberate care. The soft clink of porcelain against marble seemed to echo in the silence. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Blackstone for the first time since the confrontation began. "I accept your challenge," she said, quietly. The words were spoken so softly that several guests leaned forward to make sure they had heard correctly. But there was something in her voice, a quiet strength that cut through the tension in the room like a bell ringing in an empty cathedral. Blackstone blinked, clearly not expecting this response. He had been prepared for tears, for excuses, for the stammering retreat of someone caught pretending to be more than they were. But acceptance? That wasn't part of his script. What? He said, his cocky grin faltering for just a moment. "I said I accept your challenge," Lily repeated louder this time. "I'll play for you. And when I do, you'll give me that $1,000 you promised." A murmur ran through the room. Victoria Chen raised her eyebrows in surprise while other guests exchanged glances of disbelief and concern. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. The staff at the Meridian Club were trained to avoid conflict, to smooth over problems, not to meet them head-on. But Lily was no longer thinking like a waitress. The uniform she wore felt different now, not like a symbol of service, but like armor. She thought about the years of practice that had brought her to this moment. The early mornings in cramped practice rooms, the calluses on her fingertips from hours of scales and etudes, the competitions she had won, the scholarships she had earned, the professors who had told her she had something special. All of that was about to be tested in front of a room full of strangers who saw her as nothing more than hired help. As she walked toward the piano, her mind raced through everything that had led her to this moment. She remembered being 7 years old, sitting on a wobbly bench in her grandmother's living room, learning to play Für Elise on an old upright piano that was missing 3 keys. Her grandmother had worked 2 jobs to pay for those first lessons, sacrificing her own small pleasures so Lily could chase a dream that seemed impossible for a girl from their neighborhood. "Music doesn't care how much money you have," her grandmother used to say. "It only cares how much heart you bring to it." She remembered her first recital at age 10, wearing a dress her mother had sewn by hand because they couldn't afford to buy one from the store. Her hands had shaken so badly she could barely find the keys, but somehow the music had carried her through. The applause afterward was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She remembered the day she auditioned for music school, playing for a panel of stern-faced professors who had heard TIQ, housans of hopeful students over the years. When they accepted her with a partial scholarship, she cried for an hour in the parking lot, calling her parents from her beat-up car to share the news. And she remembered last month, when the acceptance letter from Vienna arrived. The Vienna Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. They wanted her. They believed in her talent enough to offer her a place among the world's most promising young musicians. But the cost of living in Vienna, even with the partial scholarship they offered, was more than her family could manage. The letter sat in her dresser drawer, a beautiful dream that felt just out of reach. Now, As she approached the piano bench, all of those memories swirled together into something powerful and fierce. This wasn't just about playing a song for some drunk billionaire's entertainment. This was about every person who had ever been dismissed because of their job, their background, their bank account. This was about proving that talent didn't come with a price tag attached. Behind her, she heard Blackstone say something to one of his dinner companions, his voice carrying a note of nervous laughter. He was probably realizing that his simple power play had turned into something more complicated than he intended. But it was too late now. The challenge had been issued and accepted. Lily reached the piano and paused, her hand resting on the polished wood of the bench. The Steinway was even more beautiful up close. Someone had maintained it perfectly. Every surface gleamed, every key looked pristine. This wasn't a decoration gathering dust. This was a professional instrument waiting for professional hands. She thought about what to play. Something that would prove her point without being too showy. Something that would demonstrate both technical skill and musical understanding. Something that would show these people that they had been sharing their evening with someone extraordinary, without even knowing it. As she sat down and adjusted the bench height, she caught a glimpse of the guests behind her. Most looked uncomfortable, as if they had stumbled into a situation they didn't understand. A few had their phones out, probably recording what they thought would be either a humiliating failure or an amusing curiosity. But Victoria Chen was watching with something that looked like hope in her eyes. And despite everything, that gave Lily strength. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their familiar weight and responsiveness. The piano was perfectly tuned, its voice clear and true. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself remember why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about impressing anyone or proving anything. It was about the pure joy of creating something beautiful, of taking the emotions that were too big for words and letting them flow through her fingers into melody and harmony. It was about the magic that happened when technique met passion, when hours of practice transformed into moments of transcendence. When she opened her eyes again, the room felt different. The nervous energy from the guests, Blackstone's aggressive posturing, the weight of expectation, all of it fell away. There was just her, the piano, and the music that was about to be born. She had chosen her piece. It was something that would test every aspect of her training. Technical precision, emotional depth, musical maturity. It was a piece that conservatory students spent years learning to play properly. It was also one of the most beautiful things ever written for piano. As her hands found their starting position, she thought one more time about her grandmother's words. Music doesn't care how much money you have. It only cares how much heart you bring to it. Well then, time to show them how much heart she had. The first note hung in the air like a crystal bell, pure and clear and absolutely perfect. It was followed by another, then another, each one precise and deliberate. Lily had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that demanded everything a pianist could give and more. The opening was deceptively simple, a gentle melody that seemed almost conversational. But anyone who knew classical music would recognize what was coming. This wasn't just a pretty tune. It was one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire, a composition that separated the truly skilled from the merely competent. Within seconds, the room transformed. The uncomfortable tension that had filled the air moments before evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. Even Blackstone, who had been preparing another mocking comment, found himself frozen in place, his mouth slightly open. Lily's hands moved across the keys with fluid grace, each finger finding its mark with the precision of a master archer. Years of practice had made these movements as natural as breathing. Her left hand provided a steady foundation while her right hand sang the melody, the two working together in perfect harmony. The guests who had been looking at their phones or fidgeting with their wine glasses were now completely still. Victoria Chen, who had been in the classical music world for decades, recognized immediately what she was witnessing. This wasn't just competent playing. This was artistry of the highest level. As the piece developed, Lily's interpretation began to reveal itself. She wasn't just playing the notes that Chopin had written, she was telling a story with them. The melody spoke of longing and loss, of dreams deferred and hopes that refused to die. Every phrase was shaped with careful attention to its emotional weight, every dynamic change perfectly calculated for maximum impact. The technical demands of the piece were staggering. rapid passages that required both hands to dance across the keyboard in perfect synchronization. Massive chords that tested the span of her fingers, delicate moments where a single misplaced note would shatter the musical spell she was weaving. But Lily handled it all with seemingly effortless skill. Her posture remained relaxed and natural, her breathing steady and controlled. There was no tension in her shoulders, no strain in her movements. This was what happened when years of proper training met natural talent. The impossible became inevitable. One of the guests, a man who owned several tech companies, pulled out his phone to record. But after a few seconds, he put it away again. Some moments were too special to experience through a screen. This required full attention, complete presence. The piece moved into its middle section where Chopin's genius really shone through. The melody became more complex, more urgent. Lily's hands flew across the keys, executing runs and arpeggios that looked impossible but sounded absolutely natural. The music built in intensity, creating a sense of mounting drama that had everyone in the room leaning forward unconsciously. Blackstone, who had been so confident in his mockery just minutes before, found himself completely speechless. He had expected amateur fumbling, maybe a simple tune played with obvious mistakes. Instead, he was watching a performance that would have been at home in any concert hall in the world. But Lily was just getting started. As the ballade reached its climactic passage, she threw herself into the music with complete abandon. The piano thundered under her hands, filling the marble room with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The chandeliers above seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the lower notes, while the delicate melody soared above it all like a bird riding storm winds. This was why the Steinway had been chosen for this room. Lesser instruments would have crumbled under the demands she was placing on them. But this piano responded to her touch like a perfectly trained racehorse, every nuance of her interpretation coming through with crystal clarity. The other guests were transfixed. Some had tears in their eyes, though they might not have been able to explain why. Great music had a way of bypassing the rational mind and speaking directly to the heart. It didn't matter that they were billionaires who owned private jets and island estates. In this moment, they were just human beings experiencing something beautiful and profound. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Lily made a choice that surprised even herself. Instead of ending with Chopin's written finale, she began to transition into something else entirely, an improvisation based on a melody she had been working on for months. This was dangerous territory. Improvisation at this level was like walking a tightrope without a net. There was no sheet music to fall back on, no composer's roadmap to follow. She had to trust her instincts, her training, and her musical intuition completely. The improvised section was deeply personal, drawing on her own experiences and emotions. The melody spoke of her family's journey to America, of her grandmother's sacrifices, of her own struggles to balance dreams with reality. It was the sound of hope refusing to be extinguished, of talent insisting on being heard despite every obstacle placed in its path. The guests didn't know the personal story behind the music, but they could feel its emotional truth. This wasn't just technical display. It was authentic human expression at its most raw and powerful. The music painted pictures in their minds, stirred memories they had forgotten, touched parts of their hearts they had thought permanently closed off by years of business dealings and financial success. Victoria Chen recognized what she was hearing and could barely believe it. This level of musical maturity, this depth of interpretation, this fearless creativity, it was the mark of a truly exceptional artist. The kind of musician who came along maybe once in a generation. As Lily brought her improvisation to a close, she returned to Chopin's original ending, tying her personal expression back to the master's composition with seamless skill. The final chords rang out in the marble room, each note perfectly placed and weighted, and then there was silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of earlier, when everyone was waiting to see if she would accept the challenge. This was the profound silence that follows truly great art, the moment when beauty has been created and the world seems to pause in recognition of what has just occurred. Lily sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, breathing slightly harder from the exertion. She had just poured everything she had into those few minutes of music. Every lesson, every practice session, every dream and disappointment, and hope, it had all been distilled into sound and offered to a room full of strangers. The silence stretched, on for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. In that quiet space, something fundamental had shifted. The invisible barriers between server and served, between the wealthy and the working, between those who had made it and those still climbing. All of it had been temporarily dissolved by the universal language of music. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. The applause started slowly, tentatively, as if the guests weren't quite sure it was appropriate. Then Victoria Chen began clapping with genuine enthusiasm, and suddenly the entire room erupted. The sound echoed off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers, filling every corner of the space with appreciation. Several guests rose to their feet, something that rarely happened at the Meridian Club's formal dinners. These were people accustomed to the finest entertainment money could buy: private concerts by world-famous musicians, performances at the most exclusive venues. Yet here they were, giving a standing ovation to someone they had barely noticed an hour earlier. Lily remained seated at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the intensity of the performance, and the sound of applause seemed almost surreal after months of being invisible in this very room. But not everyone was clapping. Richard Blackstone stood frozen by his chair, his face cycling through a range of expressions: shock, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. The confident smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by the dawning realization that he had just made a spectacular mistake. As the applause finally began to fade, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room again, but this time, it wasn't the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for entertainment. It was the heavy silence of a moment when everyone knows something important has just happened, but no one is quite sure what comes next. Blackstone cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. He took a few unsteady steps toward the piano, his earlier swagger completely gone. The alcohol that had made him feel invincible just minutes before now seemed to be working against him, making him clumsy and unsure. He began, then stopped. He looked at Lily, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I owe you an apology." The words came out strained, clearly difficult for him to say. This was a man who was used to being right, used to having his judgments confirmed by the world around him. Admitting he had been wrong spectacularly, publicly wrong, went against every instinct he had developed over years of success. He struggled to find words adequate to what he had just witnessed. That was extraordinary. I had no idea. I completely misjudged the situation, and I'm sorry. Lily stood slowly from the piano bench, smoothing down her uniform with nervous hands. The transformation from invisible waitress to commanding performer and back again felt disorienting, like waking up from a vivid dream. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions inside her. But Blackstone wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, his fingers fumbling with the screen. "I need to make a call, right now." The other guests watched in fascination as he dialed a number, stepping slightly away from the group but still close enough for everyone to hear. "Jennifer, it's Richard Blackstone. Yes, I know it's late. Listen, I need you to do something for me urgently. You're still on the board of the Metropolitan Opera, right? And you have connections with the Philharmonic?" He paused, listening to the response. "I need you to make some calls. Tonight, if possible. There's someone you need to hear." He glanced back at Lily, then continued speaking into the phone. "Her name is Lily Thompson, and she's the real thing. The kind of talent that comes along maybe once in a decade. Can you set up an audition? As soon as possible?" Victoria Chen stepped forward, her business instincts recognizing an opportunity. "Richard, if I may." She addressed Lily directly. "My dear, what Richard is trying to do is admirable. But let me ask you something first. What are your plans? Are you studying somewhere? Do you have representation?" Lily felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Just an hour ago, these people hadn't even noticed her presence. Now they were talking about her career as if she were their equal, their colleague. "I'm at Juilliard," she said. "I'm in my final year. And She hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I was accepted to the Vienna Conservatory for their master's program, but I can't afford to go." The room fell quiet again. Victoria and several other guests exchanged meaningful looks. In their world, financial obstacles were problems to be solved, not permanent barriers. "The Vienna Conservatory," Victoria repeated thoughtfully. That's quite an achievement just to be accepted there. Their audition process is famously rigorous. What would it cost? Asked another guest, a woman who had made her fortune in renewable energy. For the Vienna program, I mean. Everything included? Lily felt her cheeks burn. This conversation was moving into territory that made her deeply uncomfortable. She had never asked anyone for money, never expected charity from strangers. I don't think that's appropriate, she said carefully. I appreciate the thought, but I couldn't possibly. Young lady, Victoria interrupted gently. May I give you some advice? In this room tonight are people who spend more on wine in a month than most people earn in a year. For us, funding your education wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment in art itself. Blackstone, who had finished his phone call, returned to the group. His face was flushed, but now from excitement rather than alcohol and embarrassment. Jennifer is making calls as we speak. The Met wants to hear you next week, and there's a possibility of an emergency audition spot opening up with the New York Philharmonic. But that's not all, he continued, his words coming faster as his enthusiasm built. I've been thinking while I was on the phone. What happened here tonight? It was more than just a performance. It was a lesson, a reminder. He looked around at his fellow guests, including them in his thought process. How many times do we interact with people and never really see them? How many times do we make assumptions based on someone's job, their appearance, their circumstances? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable but necessary. I propose something, Blackstone continued. Not just funding for your Vienna program, though that's a given now. I want to start a foundation. Something that supports working artists, people who have to balance their art with survival, who have talent but lack the financial freedom to pursue it fully. Victoria nodded approvingly. The Lily Thompson Foundation, she suggested. It has a nice ring to it. Oh no, Lily said quickly, feeling overwhelmed. You can't name it after me. I'm just one person. There are so many others. Exactly, Blackstone said, his voice gaining strength as his vision became clearer. That's exactly the point. You're not just one person. You represent thousands of artists who are working service jobs, driving taxis, doing whatever it takes to survive while they pursue their dreams. Tonight you gave us a gift. You showed us what we've been missing. The evening that had begun as a routine business dinner had transformed into something none of them had expected. Plans were made, contacts were shared, commitments were secured. By the time the last guest left, Lily's future had been completely rewritten. 6 months later, she would be studying in Vienna, her full expenses covered by what had become known as the Meridian Foundation. The organization would go on to support hundreds of artists over the years, providing grants and opportunities to people who might otherwise never have been discovered. But perhaps more importantly, the story of that night began to spread. Videos of Lily's performance, recorded on phones by several guests, found their way to social media. The story of the Billionaire's Challenge and the waitress's triumph resonated with people around the world. It became a reminder that talent and worth are not determined by wealth or status. That the person serving your coffee or cleaning your office or waiting your table might be carrying dreams and abilities that would astound you, if you only took the time to really see them. Years later, when Lily had become an established concert pianist performing on stages around the world, she would always remember that night at the Meridian Club, not just as the moment her career began, but as the night she learned that sometimes the most important performances happen when we least expect them, for audiences we never knew we had. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those performances can change not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone who witnesses them.